Discover how one Prussian scientist's 5-year Amazon expedition rewrote our understanding of nature and planted the seeds of modern environmentalism.
Chapter 1. The Prussian Promise. The world in which Alexander von Humboldt was born was a rigorously ordered world, locked in stuffy cabinets of curiosities and bound by the rigid rules of the 18th century Prussian aristocracy, where everything had to have its precisely designated, unchanging place. For a young, brilliant mind filled with unbridled ambition and a hunger for true knowledge, this European academy, with its dead, dried specimens pinned to corkboards with rusting pins, was becoming more and more unbearable a cage each day, stifling his true calling. In the cool marble corridors of Berlin's mansions, where the air smelled of old wax and the dust of old books, Alexander often recalled the moments from his childhood when he first felt the call of the unknown. He recalled with crystal-clear clarity that one particular evening in the library at Tegel Castle, when, as a lonely boy, lit only by the flickering, warm glow of a single candle, in a style reminiscent of the most dramatic canvases of the chiaroscuro masters, he opened a heavy calfskin-bound volume containing engravings depicting the exotic flora of overseas territories. These illustrations, although made in Europe by people who had never left the continent, breathed into him an inexplicable primal energy. He saw in them gigantic spreading palm leaves, tangled lianas resembling snakes, and strange, almost alien flowers that seemed to pulsate with their own hidden life, transcending the stiff, lifeless lines of ink. It was then, amid the smell of aged paper and the cool Prussian night, that an irresistible desire to break away from this ordered nightmare and immerse himself in the green, moist, untamed chaos of true nature arose in his mind. He realized that he did not want to just categorize dead parts of the world, but wanted to stand in the very center of this gigantic, pulsating organism, feel its breathing on his own skin, and measure its powerful pulse. This early fascination, nourished by years of reading, observation, and endless study, slowly evolved into a powerful, all-encompassing vision that he came to call Naturphilosophie, a philosophy of nature that would forever change the face of science and tear down the walls erected by traditional, reductionist taxonomy. Alexander, a true polymath whose education covered an extremely wide spectrum of fields, from complex issues of geology and mineralogy through botany to the intricacies of state finances and economics, began to notice deep, invisible connections between phenomena that the science of his time treated as completely separate and independent of each other. In his groundbreaking vision, the world was not a set of isolated facts, dead rocks, and randomly scattered plants, but was one gigantic network of relationships in which the slightest change in atmospheric pressure, soil chemical composition, or air humidity resonated throughout the entire biosphere, affecting every living organism, even the smallest one. With each book he read, with each lonely inspection of the Prussian mines, where in the deaf, damp darkness he learned to read the history of the earth from the rock layers, his frustration with the scientific establishment of his time only intensified, becoming almost physical pain. He despised the pedantic classification of the world according to Carl Linnaeus's artificial systems, which stripped nature of its dynamics, reducing it to rows of dusty display cases and Latin names devoid of any spatial or climatic context. His dream was to create a science that could capture this constant global dance of the elements, a journey that would allow him to gather irrefutable evidence that the Earth's magnetism, the distribution of vegetation, the temperature of the oceans, and the shape of mountain peaks are inextricably intertwined in a brilliant, organic harmony.
However, in order to prove this revolutionary thesis, he absolutely had to leave the sterile environment of Europe. He had to go to a place where the forces of nature operated with unrestrained, brutal power, to see with his own eyes how this gigantic machinery functions in its most extreme, wild, and untainted by human hands.
The path to the implementation of this monumental undertaking, however, did not initially lead through endless oceans or impassable jungles, but through the dark, gold-filled and intrigue-filled corridors of the Spanish royal court, where the bureaucracy was as thick and dangerous as the tropical forests he so desperately wanted to reach. Before Alexander could even dream of setting foot on the South American continent, he had to perform what was considered a diplomatic miracle, obtaining official permission, a royal passport, from the Spanish Empire itself, which with paranoid suspicion guarded access to its overseas colonies from any foreigners, especially from the bright minds of Protestant Prussia. When he finally stood in the opulent halls of the Palace at Aranjuez, the contrast between his bright Enlightenment idealism-fueled vision and the stuffy, decadent atmosphere of the Spanish monarchy was striking and almost palpable in the air thick with perfume. The walls were covered with heavy crimson damasks, and huge crystal chandeliers hung from the exquisitely carved, gilded ceilings, casting harsh, shimmering light on the powdered faces of ministers and courtiers, whose sole purpose seemed to be maintaining the status quo of a declining empire. With each step on the polished marble floors, he felt the weight of centuries of Spanish domination, hidden under a layer of velvet and stiff etiquette where every gesture mattered and every word spoken could result in the undoing of his life's work. The sensual weight of the place, the roughness of the ornate chairs on which he had to spend long hours waiting for an audience, the smell of cigar smoke mingling with the scent of aging bodies and heavy perfumes, and the oppressive silence of the huge offices heightened his sense of alienation, but at the same time sharpened his determination. He knew that he could not appear before these people as a dreamy natural philosopher, but must become a pragmatic, shrewd negotiator who could translate his great scientific ambitions into the language of profits, geological maps, and potential mineral wealth, the only language that could bring life to these tired, blasé faces.
The decisive moment of the tense meeting with King Carlos IV's highest ministers finally arrived, a scene that required the Prussian aristocrat to scale absolute heights of intellectual and social sophistication to turn decades of Spanish paranoia into enthusiastic support for his mission. In a darkened office where only narrow streaks of the scorching Madrid sun showed through the thick velvet curtains, illuminating the dust particles suspended in the air like miniature constellations of stars, Alexander began his masterful spectacle of persuasion, putting all his charisma, erudition, and cunning on the line. With incredible precision, modulating his voice to sound both authoritative and subtly respectful, he began to expound to skeptical, brooding officials about the benefits that the crown could derive from his expedition, completely bypassing the sensitive philosophical issues and focusing on the tangible material and strategic benefits. Instead of talking about the poetic unity of nature, he talked about modern methods of mining engineering, about the possibility of discovering new deposits of silver and gold, about precise mapping of previously unexplored rivers that could become new key trade routes, facilitating the exploitation of the riches of the New World. He used his vast experience as a mine inspector in Franconia, recalling complex geological and financial terms that gradually dispelled the listener's distrust, replacing it with growing interest and greed, shining in their eyes with the reflected light of candelabra. His argument was like a precise, deadly dance, with each skillfully constructed sentence breaking down subsequent walls of suspicion, proving that financing his journey was not a philanthropic whim, but an extremely profitable state investment that would restore Spain to full knowledge of its own territory.
When, after many months of exhausting uphill struggle, he finally managed to obtain a unique passport with royal seals, giving him unlimited access to all Spanish domains in the Americas, he felt a huge burden being lifted from his shoulders and a burst of triumphant joy in his heart. He had managed to defeat the most powerful bureaucratic machine in the world at that time, opening the gates to the infinite green unknown.
Winning the king's mandate ushered in a period of feverish, almost manic preparations that were like arming for a great battle. Although Alexander's weapons in this fight were not swords or muskets, but the most modern, most expensive, and most precise scientific instruments that humanity had yet managed to produce. In his spacious makeshift quarters in Madrid and later in the port, there was controlled chaos filled with the smell of polish, mahogany wood and metal, where every second was devoted to meticulously packing, calibrating, and checking the equipment on which the success of the entire enterprise depended. The boxes, lined with down-soft crimson velvet, held within them true marvels of Enlightenment-era engineering, shiny brass sextants that would be used to determine their position based on the pattern of stars above the dense jungle canopy, delicate glass barometer tubes carefully filled with mercury so that he could measure atmospheric pressure on inaccessible mountain passes. There were also chronometers, whose quiet, rhythmic ticking seemed to be an artificial reflection of the heartbeat of time itself, necessary for the precise determination of longitude, as well as cyanometers for determining the intensity of the blue sky, and complex electrometers that were supposed to probe the charges hidden in the moist air of storm clouds. Humboldt treated each of these objects with reverent respect, almost as holy relics of a new religion based on empirical experience. The coolness of brass under his fingers, the smoothness of polished wood, the smell of special lubricants, all this was a physical extension of his own senses, prosthetics that would allow him to hear, see, and feel what was completely inaccessible to the naked human eye. For hours he pored over the delicate mechanisms, testing whether they would survive the deadly, dense humidity of the equatorial climate and the shocks of being transported on the backs of mules through the Andean passes, fully aware that the loss or damage of these tools would render his expedition a mere aimless, romantic vagabond devoid of any scientific measurement value.
In this whirlwind of preparations, amid crates filled with equipment and piles of dry clothes, Humboldt and his faithful newfound companion, the French botanist Aimé Bonpland, spent long, sleepless nights hunched over large, rustling sheets of old maps, trying to read the future from the imperfect lines drawn by the hands of ancient conquistadors and missionaries. The two men were a fascinating contrast that was to become the foundation of their fruitful collaboration. Alexander, vibrating with excess energy, speaking at the speed of a machine gun, constantly gesticulating and jumping from one brilliant idea to another, and Aimé, calmer, methodical, with the innate patience of someone who can watch the development of the smallest flower bud for hours, introducing an element of necessary grounding to the intellectual hurricane that was the Prussian. The candlelight cast deep, restless shadows on the spread parchments, highlighting the vast expanses of white that marked the territories of terra incognita along the Orinoco and Amazon river basins, empty spaces that in Humboldt's imagination were already filled with lush, impenetrable greenery, the predatory roars of jaguars, and the whistle of poisonous insects. Bonpland prepared his own arsenal with extraordinary precision. Hundreds of sheets of special, thick, gray paper intended for drying plants, wooden botanical presses intended to flatten and preserve the treasures of local flora, and razor-sharp scalpels and magnifying glasses. Together, in silence, broken only by the rustle of paper and the occasional clink of glass, they created a plan that seemed almost suicidal from the perspective of comfortable Europe, involving many months of wading through swamps, sailing Indian dugout canoes through unknown waters, and climbing the highest, snow-capped peaks of volcanoes dormant in the Andes. Looking through these imperfect maps together became more than just logistical planning for them. It was a ritual bonding of their destinies, building an unbreakable bond based on a shared, obsessive passion for discovering the truth about the world. The awareness that there, in this endless, humid void, the only thing they could truly rely on would be their own common sense, knowledge, and loyalty to their companion in misfortune.
Amid the technical and political noise that accompanied the organization of the expedition, there was also a deep, extremely moving personal drama, the moment of Alexander's inevitable farewell to his older brother, Wilhelm von Humboldt, who represented everything that was safe, intellectually familiar, and deeply rooted in the European culture from which the younger brother was just breaking away. Their meeting before departure had something of a melancholic image from the era of early Romanticism, full of unspeakable sadness and existential seriousness, in which two outstanding representatives of the Prussian Enlightenment stood opposite each other at the crossroads of life paths whose trajectories were to diverge radically from then on. Wilhelm, a statesman, linguist, and lover of antiquity, whose battlefield was elegant salons, the texts of classical philosophers, and subtle diplomatic games, looked at his younger brother with a mixture of boundless admiration, fear for his physical safety, and a delicate incomprehension of this wild, restless spirit that was driving him to certain doom in the equatorial hells. They stood in the dimness of the room, the air heavy with parting words, finally realizing how different they were. While Wilhelm's mind was like a beautifully composed, orderly library full of leather-bound tomes, Alexander's soul was like a mighty, untamed volcano, ready to erupt and eager to encompass the entire physical cosmos with its research. When they finally fell into each other's arms in a tight brotherly embrace, the scent of Wilhelm's exquisite cologne contrasted sharply with the subtle but noticeable scent of raw canvas and leather straps of travel bags that Alexander was already saturated with. In that short moment, suspended in time, silently exchanging glances in which tears were glistening, suppressed by the iron Prussian discipline, they both understood the horror of the situation. The probability that he would die of malaria, be eaten by predators, or drown in a nameless river was so overwhelming that this embrace could have been their last physical contact in mortal life, the seal of a choice that had no return.
The final stage of this overland odyssey, which with each kilometer took them further from the familiar, safe reality, was a tiring, exhausting carriage journey from Madrid to the cool, damp Atlantic coast, to the fortified port of A Coruña, where nature slowly began to show its more dangerous, more powerful face. After arduous days spent on the dusty roads of Castile and Galicia, the first encounter with the invigorating coastal air, saturated with thick fog and sea salt, was like a rude awakening for Humboldt, a physical shock that washed his mind of the fatigue of bureaucratic wrangling and reminded him of the scale of the elements he would soon face. As they stood on a hill overlooking the bay, below was a stark grey-green landscape of the stormy ocean, crashing with dark rhythmic fury against the sharp black rocks of the coast, and on the horizon, piercing through the storm clouds, pale, fleeting rays of sunlight twinkled, creating a spectacular, almost apocalyptic light effect straight from the greatest canvases of Caspar David Friedrich. In the center of this lively theater, in the calmer waters of a safe haven, bobbed their ticket to a new world, the magnificent, mighty Spanish mail ship Pizarro, whose sleek hull lines, rows of gagged buns, and tall masts with tangled rigging promised the strength to cross the vast depths of the ocean. Stepping into the harbor itself hit them with a wave of intense, raw sensory stimuli. Their nostrils filled with the sharp, acrid smoke of burning wood, the smell of rotting seaweed washed ashore, the thick smell of hot tar used to seal the hulls, and the sweat of dozens of burly, unshaven sailors as they screamed as they labored to load giant barrels of provisions, fresh water, and gunpowder, dragging them aboard after the creaking gangways.
In this raw, tangible reality of the port noise, the rough texture of hemp ropes, and the smell of rotting wood, Alexander finally felt the last ties connecting him with the Prussian court breaking. He was no longer just a theoretician and philosopher, but became a full-fledged traveler, standing on the very edge of a huge, inscrutable abyss.
The last night before departure, spent in a modest port tavern in A Coruña, filled with the smell of old wood and damp, passed in an atmosphere thick with unexpressed fears and sky-high excitement buzzing in their veins, as both explorers summed up all the details of their great expedition for the last time. The small square room in the attic was lit only by a few wax candles, the flames of which danced wildly under the influence of draughts penetrating through the leaky window frames, from behind which came the constant, gloomy sound of Atlantic waves crashing against the breakwater, sounding like the deep, steady breathing of a sleeping monster. In this dramatic, semi-mystical light, reminiscent of the setting of a Gothic novel, Humboldt's face seemed even sharper, almost demonic in its concentration, as his slender fingers ran nervously over the leather notebook open on the table, making sure that every chemical reagent, every barometer, and every page of blank paper were on the final loading list. Bonpland, sitting opposite, was silently polishing the brass frame of his powerful magnifying glass, and his gaze, although calm and balanced, betrayed the awareness of the risk they were taking by deciding to sail on a ship that, in addition to struggling with the power of the ocean and storms, also had to avoid attacks from ruthless British privateers patrolling these waters during the ongoing global conflict. Despite the threat of sea battle, drowning, deadly tropical diseases, famine, and encounters with hostile tribes, there was not a trace of hesitation or desire to retreat in their silent conversations. They were united by a kind of scientific fever, a common, unbreakable pact with fate, in which possible death on the altar of knowledge seemed a small price to pay for the opportunity to discover the mechanisms that govern the entire planet. Throughout that sleepless night in the tavern, in the fumes of cheap wine and dying candle wicks, they built their spiritual readiness to face the absolute unknown, preparing their minds for the moment when in the morning they would finally say goodbye to everything that had previously defined their safe old world from the deck of the ship.
The morning of the final departure dawned crisp, cold, and piercing, shrouding the entire bay and the city of A Coruña in a thick, pearly fog that muffled sounds and gave the outlines of buildings and station ships a dreamlike, mysterious quality, as if all reality was slowly dissolving before their eyes. As the first rays of dawn began to break timidly through the thick, humid air, coloring the fog in shades close to pale purple and coppery gold, Humboldt and Bonpland, wearing thick woolen coats against the piercing cold of the Atlantic breeze, supervised the transport of their most delicate, treasured crates to the creaking decks of the lifeboats that would take them to the more deeper water Pizarro. Each step he took on the slippery, algae-covered stones of the harbor quay echoed loudly and symbolically in Alexander's mind. With each breath, he inhaled the scent of great adventure into his lungs, feeling the adrenaline mix with the drops of icy drizzle settling on his clean-shaven cheeks and neatly arranged hair, which was now beginning to tangle in the wind. He watched, his heart fluttering in his chest like a trapped bird, as massive, wind-swept Galician sailors, their faces deeply wrinkled from salt and sun, deftly gripped heavy instrument cases, shouting to each other unintelligible, gravelly commands that stood in brutal physical contrast to the refined, quiet debates that had previously taken place in Madrid's drawing rooms. When they finally boarded the lifeboat themselves and the oars splashed into the icy dark green waters, separating them physically from the mainland of Europe, the Prussian aristocrat felt a strange, unexpected feeling of complete freedom, a kind of joyful release from the shackles of heavy matter. The oak planks of the boat vibrating under his feet became the only ground, and everything they left behind
dusty universities, ossified hierarchies, stuffy palaces became in a split second an insignificant, distant dream in the face of the power of the endless pulsating blue that was to take them straight to the heart of the tropical jungle.
The last deeply memorable scene of this prologue took place when Pizarro, with the majestic creaking of tightening ropes and the loud crack of unraveling canvases, began his slow, majestic dance with the elements, sailing from the safe embrace of the port of A Coruña into the open, stormy, and dangerous waters of the Atlantic Ocean, leaving only a quickly disappearing foamy trail behind the stern. The ship's huge white sails, catching a sudden favorable gust of wind, billowed with great force, and the whole massive structure of the ship suddenly tilted to the side, cutting the incoming waves with its prow with a dull, rhythmic boom that drowned out the shouts of the officers and the calls of seagulls circling above the masts in search of scraps of food. Alexander von Humboldt, unfazed by the cold and the splashes of icy water that hit the railing with force, stood proudly at the very bow of the ship, staring at the endless line of the horizon, where the dark, menacing blue of the stormy ocean merged with the dramatic steel-gray clouds rushing across the sky, creating a powerful, painterly landscape full of endless thunder and stunning beauty. In his bright, wide-open eyes, reflecting the changing, capricious light of the Atlantic morning, one could see a fascinating, complex mixture of the deepest emotions, the powerful iron determination of a scientist who had just broken free from golden shackles, boyish, unbridled delight at the upcoming encounter with the dream-green jungle, but also a subtle dose of natural human fear of infinity and death hidden deep at the bottom of the soul, lurking in the depths. The wind ruffled his clothes and salty sea foam crystallized on his collar, but he didn't take a step back. The old world, with its safe, rational divisions and still life trapped in display cases, disappeared forever behind him, while in front of him, hidden somewhere beyond the line of the raging ocean, stretched a gigantic, humid, green continent, a new world pulsating with life, ready to reveal to him all for the first time in history its inscrutable, brilliant, and brutal secrets.
Chapter 2. Fever Coast. When, in July 1799, the feet of Alexander von Humboldt and Aimé Bonpland first touched the sun-baked, rugged land of Cumaná, Venezuela, the sensory impact was almost overwhelming, reminiscent of a powerful physical blow delivered by untamed nature itself. The initial euphoria that accompanied them during the last days of the cruise, this naive European joy of reaching the shores of the so-called New World, was immediately and mercilessly suppressed by the brutal, tangible reality of the tropics. The heat here was not just a meteorological phenomenon, an abstract record on the thermometer scale. It was a predatory, omnipresent entity, a thick, pulsating matter that surrounded their bodies like a wet, hot woolen blanket, making every, even the shallowest breath difficult. The bustling market square of Cumaná that first appeared to their stunned eyes was a vibrant, chaotic kaleidoscope of colors and sounds, completely foreign to their previous experience. The air vibrated with the shrill, almost hysterical shrieks of brightly feathered macaws, intermingling with the guttural calls of local traders, creating a cacophony unbearable to the unaccustomed ear. The heat here was not just a meteorological phenomenon, an abstract record on the thermometer scale. It was a predatory, omnipresent entity, a thick, pulsating matter that surrounded their bodies like a wet, hot woolen blanket, making every, even the shallowest breath difficult. The bustling market square of Cumaná that first appeared to their stunned eyes was a vibrant, chaotic kaleidoscope of colors and sounds completely foreign to their previous experience.
The air vibrated with the shrill, almost hysterical shrieks of brightly feathered macaws, intermingling with the guttural calls of local traders, creating a cacophony unbearable to the unaccustomed ear. The smells mixed into a thick, intoxicating mixture, the sweet, almost sickly smell of overripe guavas and mangoes bursting in the sun, the sharp nostril corrosive stench of fish drying in the sun, the metallic smell of fresh blood from the slaughterhouse, and the heavy, musky aroma of human sweat. All this created an almost hallucinogenic vision in which the colors seemed unnaturally saturated, and the shadows cast by the makeshift canopies made of palm leaves covered the stands with an impenetrable damp blackness. With each step, putting their feet on the red-hot sand and slippery mud, both travelers realized with a thrill of fascination and anxiety that they had crossed an invisible border separating the orderly, predictable world of European scientific salons from the kingdom where nature, merciless and all-powerful, dictated absolutely all conditions.
The biodiversity surrounding them at every step was paralyzing in its infinite fractal complexity, constituting a brutal and absolute contrast to the restrained, orderly, and predictable temperate forests they knew from Europe, from the cold regions of Prussia, or the elegant, well-kept parks of France. Here, on the Cumana coast, every tiny stretch of space was dominated by predatory, untamed vegetation that seemed to be waging a constant, ruthless war for every ray of sunlight and every drop of precious moisture. The trees, resembling the gargantuan size of ancient Gothic cathedrals, rose to the sky on monstrous buttress roots resembling huge tentacles, the bark of which was thick, rough, and covered with a complex network of lichens and damp, spongy moss, the color of which was such a deep green that it was almost charcoal black. Millions of lianas hung from their powerful, spreading crowns, thick and muscular like sleeping green anacondas, entwined in complex, impossible to untangle knots that seemed to pulsate with their own hidden rhythm of life. The sunlight, harsh and merciless in the open space of the beach, had difficulty breaking through the dense, multi-layered canopy of leaves, creating dramatic point illuminations on the jungle floor, reminiscent of the dark, atmospheric chiaroscuro effects known from the canvases of old Dutch masters or the romantic visions of Caspar David Friedrich. In these rare, luminous shafts of light, full of swirling dust and moisture, plant forms appeared with structures so complex and bizarre that they resembled intricate, symmetrical engravings born in the mind of a brilliant illustrator like Ernst Haeckel, rather than ordinary, common earthly thickets. Giant ferns unfurled their toothed crosiers with almost mathematical spiral precision, and wild orchids with colors so brilliant, poisonous purples, screaming yellows, and deep bloody crimsons, that they seemed to glow with their own unnatural glow, tempted multicolored insects with their complex, ruthless trap-like cups, a spectacle as beautiful as it was terrifying. In the face of this overwhelming, suffocating, and organic chaos, Humboldt, initially in his absolute intellectual element, threw himself into his work with a frenetic, almost manic energy, treating hard science as his most powerful shield against the madness of the pulsating world around him. The beach in Cumana, dazzling his sore eyes with its chalky whiteness under the merciless, almost vertical sun of the tropics, became his first hastily improvised laboratory on the very edge of the great, terrifying unknown. With feverish haste, forgetting about the fatigue after the journey, he took out his precious instruments from their chests, shining with a cold, alien glow of brass, whose perfectly geometric, sharp shapes constituted a blatant visual dissonance against the background of the wild, irregular, and asymmetric nature of the forest.
He set up heavy three-legged brass stands on the loose, hot sand, precisely leveling theodolites and shiny sextants to measure magnetic declination to an absolute fraction of a degree, while rivers of salty sweat poured from his eyes, and his hands continually slithered on the metal knobs, hot as iron in a forge. His famous cyanometer, a precision instrument with many graduated shades of blue, was used to obsessively, repeatedly measure the color of the sky which here, in the equatorial zone, took on a color so intense, so deep and terrifying azure, that it seemed almost completely unnatural, as if it heralded the imminent arrival of some difficult-to-name cosmic catastrophe. With tireless passion, he measured the temperature of the soil, heated to the limits of biological strength, noting,
Aimé Bonpland, no less possessed by the scientific fever peculiar to researchers, followed Humboldt through the thickets like his faithful, hard-working shadow, constituting the perfect botanical alter ego of the Prussian, and his initial innocent fascination with the powerful flora of the New World quickly turned into a kind of insatiable intellectual obsession that consumed all his time. With huge armloads of special copper botanical cans and heavy wooden plant presses, he ventured every day to the edge of the dense, almost impenetrable jungle, where the thick shade offered only an illusory, false relief from the scorching sun, but was in fact the thick, viscous soup of steaming, disease-causing humid air. He collected the unusual specimens he encountered at a frenetic pace, tearing off intricate leaves, flexible shoots, and dazzling flowers with a rapacious greed, convinced in the depths of his educated soul that Carl Linnaeus's mighty universal classification system, that sacred, inviolable book of European taxonomy, was fully capable of absorbing and ordering this endless, green pressing flood without any problem. Each newly discovered plant was a personal triumph for him, a powerful shot of adrenaline, but their astronomical number and unimaginable bizarre orthology began to slowly but surely overwhelm the capacity of his analytical mind. He came across flowers with forms resembling angry predatory insects, with petals covered with soft, velvety fuzz and emitting pheromones and scents so powerful and concentrated that they literally made him feel dizzy and nausea. His hands, constantly covered with sticky, milky plant sap, brown earth, and tiny stinging scratches from the razor-sharp serrated edges of palm fronds, worked tirelessly, arranging extremely delicate and fragile structures in heavy presses with the tenderness of a surgeon performing a complex operation. At this early stage of the expedition, both brilliant young gentlemen were still absolutely convinced of their inviolable position as cold, detached, objective observers, standing proudly above the wild ecosystem, tightly protected by the thick armor of their solid European education and Enlightenment cool arrogance, unaware that the forest was watching them closely. However, the natural environment of Venezuela, initially treated by them as a large but passive cabinet of curiosities, very quickly and extremely brutally began to respond directly to their invasive, noisy presence, gradually crushing the hard illusion of their scientific dominance and reminding them in an extremely painful way of their pathetic, mortal human physicality. The heat they had initially fought with their wills had, after a few days, ceased to be merely a measurable phenomenon bordering on meteorology, and had become a slow, methodical torture inflicted by the sun gods, which inexorably drained them of every last drop of energy, turning their powerful male muscles into useless, quivering ballast, and their logical, sharp thoughts into a sticky, unbearably slow, muddy mess. Invisible to the human eye, microscopic life forms began a massive, merciless siege of their modest burning camp. The omnipresent destructive humidity, permanently suspended in the heavy air like thick fog in a seaside port, began to maliciously and methodically destroy the material effects of their hard, daily work. The exquisite, carefully greased leather of their precious journals, in which they had so lovingly recorded their absolutely priceless original observations, was day by day covered with a thick, disgusting, greenish-black layer of moss and mold with a pungent smell of decay. and the snow-white pages swelled, wrinkled, and waved, smearing the intricately inked calligraphic tables and precise charts. Shining so far proud brass, pierwszy cios z tego niewidzialnego, slipiącego enemia fell na nich sadlenie w split second without any clear prelude or warning, shattering their previously safe rakin to pieces on one of the steamy, muggy, and windless afternoons when the air literally stood still, heavy, lifeless, and thick as molten hot lead in a foundry. Bonpland, who only a few long moments earlier had been leaning with almost boyish enthusiasm over a rare, stunning specimen of a blood-red passion flower with strange stamens, suddenly stopped mid-move and froze, and his previously precise movements became suddenly uncoordinated and strangely sluggish, resembling the behavior of a broken wooden puppet whose strings had been violently tangled. An armful of carefully collected and sorted fragrant leaves slipped silently from his relaxed, limp hands, falling with a gentle, mournful rustle onto the rotting jungle floor full of ants, and he swayed extremely dangerously, nervously trying to find some support with his hand on the huge trunk of a nearby old ficus tree covered with extremely slippery moss. When the anxious Humboldt turned towards him, alarmed and intrigued by the sudden unnatural break in the heated discussion, the sight he immediately encountered immediately froze his blood, causing a powerful shiver of terror despite the unbearable, murderous, even hellish tropical heat prevailing around him. The French botanist's face, usually dark red from enormous physical exertion and the scorching sun, now took on a phenomenal, ghastly ash-gray shade from which all life had completely drained in the blink of an eye, making him look unmistakably like a waxy, terrifying mask of death, which was a drastic, eye-catching contrast to the infinitely deep greenery of the lush rainforest surrounding them, vibrating with health and brutal energy. Only a quiet, broken, half-animal moan came from his chapped lips, cracked from the lack of fresh water, and then his strong, traveling knees gave way completely limply under the weight of his body, and this powerfully built man fell heavily face first to the ground with a dull thud, becoming the first victim. Before the terrified Humboldt could even fully process the sudden shock, control the rush of sheer panic, and take any coordinated, organized, rational rescue action towards his unconscious companion lying unconscious in the mud, he suddenly felt another, invisible, icy, and bony hand clasped with merciless superhuman force directly on his own neck, heralding the inevitable fall of the second of the great, proud explorers of the new era. While dragging Bonpland's heavy, absolutely limp and faint body through the malicious tangle of protruding roots, grasping vines, and sharp ferns back to their primitive, rented, stuffy, and shadowy quarters in the heart of Cumana, Humboldt suddenly felt a powerful, deeply paralyzing, and logic-defying drop in the temperature of his own body, absurd in the context of the literally boiling air surrounding him, the zenith of the merciless sun of a humid hell. Violent, spasmodic, and uncontrollable shudders shook his body with such devastating violence that his teeth began to chatter loudly against each other in a macabre rhythm, and his hands, which until then had operated so reliably and precisely with the most delicate micrometer, were unable to hold the simple, rough clay cup containing the lukewarm rescue water at all. The previously unknown piercing cold penetrated painfully to the very marrow of his bones, slowly freezing his logical, analytical thoughts, only to give way only a few hours later to a powerful, unstoppable wave of burning.
With the inexorable steady increase in the temperature of his tormented body, the grim reality surrounding the feverish Humboldt slowly but surely began to distort, melt at the edges and mutate ghastly, drawing his extremely exhausted mind straight into the darkest, hallucinogenic, powerfully swirling vortex of terrifying and profound delirium, in which the orderly, rational world of cold European science was irretrievably mixed with the darkest, subconscious, archaic nightmares of primitive man. The cramped, damp, and extremely dark room of their rented quarters, dimly lit only by the wavering, uneven, weak flame of a single, miserable wax candle, casting huge, grotesque, and unnaturally elongated shadows on the uneven, whitewashed walls, reminiscent of the best aesthetics of dark romanticism and horror, suddenly began to transform in his diseased mind into an authentic, a living, breathing, predatory Amazon jungle from which they had only just escaped. In his feverish, terrifyingly realistic visions, he watched with a growing, paralyzing, even atavistic fear of the helplessly trapped insect in the spider's web, as powerful, monstrous, and completely mutated plants with enormous force crashed through the thick, solid wooden boards of the rotten floor, growing at some completely unnatural, lightning-fast and magical pace, while their thick, moist, pulsating with thick resinous and green juices, their stems writhed in the dimness of the room like great prehistoric snakes awakened from their lethargy, ready to fatally attack weak victims. He also saw in his madness how his beloved, dearest precision-measuring instruments inexplicably came to life and began to spin in a ghostly, demonic dance. The cyanometer, until then lying politely in a leather box, spun in the air without the slightest restraint, pointing to the non-existent, blasphemous colors of an imaginary sky straight from other, alternative, and deeply hellish dimensions. And sharp, toothy, and shiny in the darkness, the brass, cold arm of the large sextant slowly but surely bent, and finally, with murderous intent, clamped like a vice around his own withered throat, mercilessly choking him with that terrifying, iron grip of cold rationality materialized. The bottom of the absolute, profound, physical, and complete mental decline came inexorably in those darkest, terrible, and psychologically endless hard hours just before the longed-for dawn, when the inky darkness seemed to gain once again the real weight, density, and terrifying coldness of the earth dug straight from a deep tomb, and the thin air in the closed, stuffy room became something thick, poisonous, and absolutely impossible to breathe, saturated with the thick, sweet stench of sweat and the palpable, approaching shadow of certain death. It was at this critical, liminal moment, lying helplessly and stinking, heavy and sticky, completely wet with poisonous fever, twisted and torn sheets of questionable cleanliness, that the disoriented Humboldt was finally forced to face the deepest, most poignant, even devastating despair and resignation that he had ever, even in the worst-case scenarios, had the displeasure to experience in his former, incredibly safe, courtly, and infinitely privileged academic life. To face this brutal, naked, icy cold, and downright overwhelming awareness of one's complete, individual helplessness and biological fragility. Linnaeus's great, almost divinely revered botanical system, the hard and rigorous physical equations that define the immutable laws of gravity, all the carefully accumulated pride and wisdom of dusty European libraries and prestige over long, arduous centuries.
When this delicate, almost transparent thin line separating conscious life from dark, impenetrable death seemed to be completely and finally blurring and disappearing for them, and both proud researchers had long since, in great pain, lost the absolute remnants of their human strength, in the darkness of their makeshift, miserable bedroom appeared silently, like a ghost from another era, the silent and extremely ghostly figure of a local indigenous tribal healer, brought there in a desperate act of last-ditch rescue by their worried, paid local Indian guides. His silent and slow entry into this closed operational space, until then completely and authoritarianly mastered and controlled by cold European rationalized science, and now pathetically by the defeated jungle lying helplessly on its blades, had something of an incredibly deep,
ancient, and even extremely symbolic rite of smooth passage, clearly marking the turning point and the great moment of the dramatic, complete, and unconditional capitulation of the haughty Western rationalism Enlightenment. This figure, tightly enveloped in the magical curling smoke from a small fragrant incense made of local resins and very dimly lit only by the wavering, yellowish flickering glow of the home hearth, constituted absolutely the most drastic possible visual and deeply philosophical contrast to the shiny, mechanically perfect, and completely useless expensive brass surveying instruments from Berlin. This healer did not bring with him elegant medical bags containing shiny boiled scalpels, nor did he carry thick pharmacopoeias bound in thick tanned leather with precise Latin indexes of substances, but only coarse bags containing bundles of strangely ugly twisted and dusty roots, dried rough sheets of unknown bark wrinkled in the sun, and handfuls of freshly collected sharp and extremely pungent-smelling hairy leaves with completely irregular asymmetric shapes resembling hands, holding in their hands hard vessels carved from bulging gourds. The very long-term, almost ritualistic treatment that this extremely mysterious, nameless curandero then subjected them to was an incredibly, even overwhelmingly sensual process, almost coarsely tactile and deeply spicy earthy, completely different from the rigorous methods of the then great Western medicine and salon surgery, which they knew from their sterile and cold homes, based on bloodletting and sterile bandages, on which they were so based. With an extremely brutal but firm determination necessary for survival, this healer almost forced Humboldt, who was only half conscious and muttered to himself about the angles of the sun, to swallow at regular intervals thick, extremely difficult to swallow decoctions made from the bark of the magic cinchona, ground and powdered. It was this wonderful, invigorating cinchona, known to them from the engravings, whose extremely shockingly bitter, almost obviously toxic-seeming taste macabrely twisted the lips, burning the tormented dry esophagus with real living chemical fire, but in turn successfully carrying within itself an extremely powerful botanical alkaloid capable of stopping the destructive multiplication of the bloodthirsty spores of malignant malaria in their tormented and infected bloodstreams, ultimately saving their fragile lives. At the same time, with rough, calloused from years of hard work without tools, dark hands, with the distinct smell of black earth and the deeply moist, dense equatorial forest, he tirelessly applied to their foreheads that were breathing with living fire, burning with devastating fever, painful sunken chests, and pulsing swollen veins on both exhausted necks, with an extremely brutal but firm determination necessary for survival, this healer almost forced Humboldt, who was only half conscious and muttered to himself about the angles of the sun, to swallow at regular intervals thick, extremely difficult to swallow decoctions made from the bark of the magic cinchona, ground and powdered. It was this wonderful, invigorating cinchona, known to them from the engravings, whose extremely shockingly bitter, almost obviously toxic-seeming taste macabrely twisted the lips, burning the tormented dry esophagus with real living chemical fire, but in turn successfully carrying within itself an extremely powerful botanical alkaloid capable of stopping the destructive multiplication of the bloodthirsty spores of malignant malaria in their tormented and infected bloodstreams, ultimately saving their fragile lives. At the same time, with rough, calloused from years of hard work without tools, dark hands, with the distinct smell of black earth and the deeply moist, dense equatorial forest, he tirelessly applied to their foreheads that were breathing with living fire, burning with devastating fever, painful sunken chests, and pulsing swollen veins on both exhausted necks.
The breakthrough in this unequal, silent, and bloody clash between titans and microscopic killers finally came in the calmest, absolutely deepest, and darkest phase of the passing night, bringing with it a violent, shocking, and incredibly exhausting physiological storm inside both aching organisms that was a clear sign and finally heralded the desired, long-awaited end of the delirious nightmare, giving the green light for the return to the world of surviving, sentient, living beings. Young Humboldt's disease-emaciated body, which had been stretched continuously for many endless, murderous days like a rusty, damp string subjected to extreme temperatures on a gridiron, suddenly felt trembling and went completely limp in a powerful, liberating spasm of muscular relaxation, and from his burning skin, through millions of open and red-hot pores, a gigantic, uncontrollable wave, reeking of disease and toxins, was released at one moment. Icy, even brisk sweat, which, to everyone's surprise, with the force of a waterfall, literally soaked his hemp bedding completely dry within a dozen or so miserable minutes. This spectacular, even violent bursting of the heavy lead curtain of high fever absolutely resembled the spectacular bursting of some huge stone-built river dam, which was immediately followed in his perception by a sudden, even shockingly painful shock cooling of the entire interior. It was a physical and mental energy exhaustion of both researchers, pushed to such absolute critical limits of endurance and life phenomena that even an attempt to lift and twitch the delicate, dry eyelid after waking up seemed to initially require a titanic, unimaginable muscular effort for both of them. It was the final transition from the regions of shadow and fighting ghosts to the world of the living, although this return was as painful as a snake shedding its molt. The morning, which quite sluggishly and lazily followed this powerful physiological and extremely important breakthrough for the researchers, was undoubtedly for both of them like a metaphysical awakening inside a completely new, previously unknown, strange cognitive dimension, in which absolutely every material thing, every smallest, seemingly insignificant detail of the room's furnishings, suddenly acquired a new, deep, and unprecedented cognitive importance, and from then on, a completely irreversible change in the perception of one's own importance for nature, universe. Their still visible extreme physical exhaustion after the battle for their own cells and organs, which made their limbs, weak as matches, tremble with every, even the smallest trivial effort they made to drink from a cup, and their once perfectly fitted European traveling outfits by the best tailors, now hung on them like grotesque skeletons, paradoxically and extremely interestingly, was internally connected with a rare and extremely valuable for great researchers, with the almost crystalline and piercing clarity of the powerful mind and senses of reality perception. When Humboldt, extremely slow and weak at first, with his aching hands still resembling helpless claws torn from the carcass of a bird of prey, reached for the first time in weeks for his large brass magnetic compass, fatefully left on the old table and already clearly tarnished, covered with an acrid greenish patina of ubiquitous moisture, he clearly felt a certain tangible, deep, and internally powerful, even cold distance emerging, slowly, silently, but inexorably, between himself as a biological man and his once so beloved and treated with great reverence old, outstanding, mechanical, inanimate tools intended only for rigid, artificial dimensioning. Suddenly he realized with great clarity how small, insignificant, downright ridiculous.
In these difficult, slow, very quiet and reflective days of arduous physical convalescence, consisting in forcing food and fluids into the body, an exceptionally strong, specific, and to a very large extent completely unspoken and non-verbal, powerful bond of great, almost fraternal understanding was developed between Humboldt and the weak Bonpland, which for their future research was from then on much stronger and many times more durable than any previous stiff, cold, the official camaraderie and purely scientific partnership imposed by the Prussian court, from which they set out for glory.
Those sparse and timid silent glances that they regularly exchanged in the room over warm, steaming bowls of thin but extremely thick and fortifying yellow chicken broth, carefully brought and cooked in a hearth with local herbs by their concerned rural hosts from around Cumana, carried in their dimension the powerful, almost existential and overwhelming weight of their great, fresh, and absolutely shared, cruelly brutal medical trauma. It was a great pain, almost indescribable on any scale. It was a spiritual burden belonging only and exclusively to two trusted, kindred, and wounded souls of young adventurers who had just a moment ago looked bravely, directly, and together, shoulder to shoulder, into the impenetrable, dark, and final, terrible, toothless maw of nothingness and cold, and by some powerful, unheard-of, happy miracle managed to escape from these monstrous, even slip out of the sticky embrace of the inevitable reaper by crawling back. Every smallest, hidden under the blankets and silent moan of pain and powerlessness of a tormented companion experienced during the recurring remnants of small, tiring attacks of muscular chills with fever, released to the surface every single tiniest, barely audible hiss and a single eloquent breath of relief and thanks to the Creator, released right after the gentle administration of cooling, lukewarm water from a large, hand-carved from wood and fired with clay porous jug, became a new cement for the creation of brotherhood. When, after the arduous, slow, long passage of almost endless, difficult, and extremely exhausting 2 whole weeks of constant feverish weakness in bed, these great Prussian and French men finally managed to miraculously gather and muster enough of their precious basic strength and the necessary reserve in the exhausted muscles of their legs to open the door with a very shaky, extremely uncertain, and slow small step under their own power, and finally leave forever this extremely tight, claustrophobic, and stuffy space of your depressing infirmary with the smell of fever and medicinal, stuffy herbs, and uncertainly, but with dignity, standing shoulder to shoulder on the ground under the roof of the sky, feel the sun and the wind hitting your face again. Then they stood again in the strong, sharp, blinding, almost unbearable, bright equatorial splendor of the great and cruel midday zenith sun, reflecting brightly off the sandy path and the white walls, slowly accepting the fact that the entire bustling and wonderful animal, human, and plant world functioning vividly outside greeted their exit back into the bosom of nature with a completely apparent, cold, complete, and terrifying indifference of vegetation, the immutability and arrogance of great power without mercy or empathy, paying absolutely no special attention to their personal, great medical dramas and suffering from the vestibule of death, which they almost succumbed to. The noisy and wild, large indigenous urban market in the center of the Cumana settlement, without an ounce of empathy or pity for them, still as before, loudly, wildly, and noisily vibrated strongly in the heat and wind from hundreds of vulgar and incomprehensible shouts of vendors and predatory loud sellers of monkeys and fruit, while the famous, from the report, the great suffocating and oppressive heat without the slightest.
Chapter 3. Whispers of the Orinoco.
In the stuffy, heavy, almost tangible smell of slowly decaying parchment, musty and dry dust of centuries of colonial archives in Caracas, Alexander von Humboldt spent endless, exhausting hours bending with almost reverence over the sprawling, fragile, and yellowed maps, which in their naivety and inaccuracy were more like works of fantastic abstract art than reliable cartographic documents based on empirical measurements. The merciless rays of the afternoon sun, struggling to break through the narrow, barred windows of the solid adobe colonial building, cut the dense air, saturated with dancing dust particles, with razor-sharp, phenomenal shafts of light, creating a deep, dramatic chiaroscuro on his sickly, pale face, still bearing traces of the recent fever, but absolutely focused.
In front of him, on a massive oak table, lay majestic engravings of ancient Spanish conquistadors and meticulous Jesuit missionaries, full of vast, disturbing white spots, marked with the ominous and fascinating inscription Terra Incognita, or worse, filled with fantastic drawings of two-headed snakes, headless men with faces on their torsos, and legendary cities built of solid gold. However, it was not the mythical El Dorado dripping with blood and greed that attracted the keen analytical eye of the Prussian scientist, but a certain absolute hydrological paradox, persistently recurring in local legends, whispered in corners and fiercely and arrogantly denied by European scientists. Whispers about the Casiquiare Canal, a mythical river lost in a green hell that supposedly connected two of the most gigantic, powerful river systems in South America, the Orinoco Basin and the Amazon Basin, haunted him, vibrating in his mind like an intrusive, unsolved mathematical equation. For outstanding European cartographers, safely locked in their sterile, cold offices in Paris or London, it was an absolute impossibility, a clear heresy violating the basic, inviolable laws of physics and hydrology, assuming in its absurdity that masses of water could flow in two opposite directions on such a slight, almost imperceptible slope of the land, brazenly cutting through the natural continental watershed. But Humboldt, with a mind as coldly rational as he was insatiable in its hunger for knowledge, saw it not as a heresy, but as a grand, monumental challenge to science itself, a fascinating, dangerous riddle whose final empirical solution could completely and irrevocably redefine the understanding of the geography of the New World, forcing the old continent to bitterly reassess its arrogant self-confidence in the face of the immeasurable mysteries of a powerful nature. The analysis of these age-old documents was a process more reminiscent of the archaeology of human imagination than cold science, because each line drawn on the rough parchment, cracking under the fingers, carried the weight of past expeditions that had been swallowed up by the jungle, and the smell of dried, rusty ink seemed to mix with the silent screams of those who had faded into oblivion in search of the truth hidden beyond the horizon. Humboldt, running his fingertips over the rough surface of the maps, where the river lines suddenly ended in nothingness, felt a physical, even intellectual thrill, knowing that it was in this vast, indescribable void that the purpose of his existence lay, that his European instruments, gleaming with brass and glass, would soon be put to the ultimate test against the merciless green maze, and that proving Casiquiare's existence would become his personal triumph over the ignorance of the era, even if the price for this discovery was astronomically high and paid for with his own blood, sweat, and madness. However, before the expedition could even approach the green gates of the jungle, the Prussian,
in search of true knowledge, not that recorded in official, dutiful registers, but that raw, living, and brutal, Humboldt and Bonpland finally left the aristocratic districts on the hills and went down into the steamy, chaotic, muddy streets of the lower parts of the city, where races, languages, and smells mixed in smoky, second-rate taverns and noisy markets, creating an intoxicating mixture. It was there, amidst the deafening noise, the thick smoke of cheap tobacco, the pungent smell of raw rum from the sugarcane, rotting fruit and horse sweat, that the researchers began the painstaking process of collecting bits of information from people who actually knew the river. Veterans of failed expeditions, dark-skinned zombos, indigenous fishermen and silent alligator hunters, whose skin was tanned by the sun, staring into empty glasses with the similarity of an old leather strap. Each story about Casiquiare he heard there was a piece of a vast linguistic and geographical puzzle. Humboldt had to filter through accounts distorted by alcohol and fear, trying to fish out grains of empirical truth from an ocean of exaggeration, relearning the names of places and currents in dozens of different, dying dialects that sounded to the European ear like incomprehensible birdsong, but which contained within them the precise knowledge accumulated over generations about the whims of the powerful river.
He then realized with growing humility that the wisdom gathered in the dusty archives of the old world was but a pale, lifeless shadow compared to the living, pulsating, and often brutal knowledge of these simple people, for whom the river was not a line on a map, but a deity, a breadwinner, and the most cruel of murderers, with whom they had to make daily, uncertain pacts for survival. The culmination of this search was a tense, distrustful meeting with the man who would become their main guide, an indigenous river veteran with a face covered with deep wrinkles like dried riverbeds, whose eyes, as black and impenetrable as the waters of the Rio Negro, seemed to see through the soul of the Prussian aristocrat, assessing his weaknesses. The negotiations took place in a stuffy room where the air was so heavy that they could hardly breathe, and the contrast between the two worlds was striking. Humboldt, surrounded by his notebooks, shiny brass instruments, and rational Enlightenment optimism, stood before a man whose entire existence was intertwined with the dark, animistic forces of the jungle, and who treated the expedition up the Orinoco not as a scientific experiment, but as a dangerous desecration of sacred territories. The guide did not only demand payment in hard coin, pearls, or glass beads. His conditions were much deeper. They concerned respect, absolute obedience in the face of the signs given by nature, and acceptance of the fact that in the heart of the jungle it is not man, but the river that dictates the laws. His slow, monotonous voice dreamed of places where water boils and trees bleed, putting a hard line between European pride and the power of absolute wilderness. As silence fell over the table, Humboldt felt the physical weight of this agreement and realized that hiring this man was not a commercial transaction, but entrusting him with his life, a final act of trust in someone whose motivations he could not fully understand, and who alone held the key to the gates of the hidden unknown world he so desperately wanted to break into. It was during these long nightly negotiations that the guide began to tell his stories, which initially sounded like naive fairy tales to the European scientist's ears, but as he listened, they began to sow disturbing, icy seeds of doubt in his mind, undermining his absolute faith in the power of the glass and the eye. The old man spoke of Yakumama, the mother of waters, a gigantic mythical water serpent, more powerful than the largest anacondas, capable of causing a whirlwind with a single blow of its tail.
Loading scientific instruments into this primitive, damp shell was a painful and ironic contrast, a collision of the highest achievements of the European Enlightenment with the brutal, primordial reality of the South American jungle, a process that required almost surgical precision and concentration. Delicate tube barometers filled with toxic heavy mercury, susceptible to breaking at the slightest shock. Chronometers whose precise tick-tock was the only reminder of the passage of time in Europe. Mirror sextants, shiny with polished brass. Hygrometers made of human hair and precision telescopes. All this had to be packed in special padded mahogany boxes, wrapped in blankets, and carefully isolated from the ubiquitous moisture seeping into every crevice. In the glare of the blazing sun, the metal and glass pieces of the equipment gleamed with an unnatural, almost cosmic glow against the rough, cracked and river-stained piragua wood, looking like artifacts left behind by an alien civilization. Humboldt watched anxiously as the native porters carried these priceless items with indifference, knowing that one false step, one slip in the slippery mud, could destroy a fortune's worth of equipment and ruin the chance of any accurate measurements. There was a deep, bitter irony in this act, bringing the most advanced, fragile technology designed to classify and order the world into the very heart of an environment that had been created by nature to digest, destroy with rust, devour with mold, and reduce to dust all expressions of human structure and rigor, and every drop of sweat that fell on the brass compass was a reminder of this inevitable conflict. Equally dramatic, but completely different in character, was the silent battle fought by Aimé Bonpland,
whose botanical obsession forced him to fight the most invisible yet most effective enemy in the jungle, the air saturated with water. Bonpland spent long, grueling hours in a makeshift camp, hunched over huge stacks of gray, highly absorbent paper, preparing his botanical presses, which were absolutely crucial to preserving the collected specimens from the devastating process of rotting. This process was hard work. Almost every collected plant, stunning in its beauty and unique in Europe, from the smallest fern to giant liana leaves, had to be carefully dried, laid flat, and subjected to pressure. But in this climate, instead of drying, the paper absorbed moisture from the air, becoming a moist, warm compress, an ideal environment for the rapid, destructive development of black mold. Every morning, with irritation and despair, the Frenchman had to dry the paper over the embers of the fires again, choking on the acrid smoke, touching the rough texture of drying leaves and sticky stems with juices. His work was a Sisyphean effort to capture the fleeting, ephemeral beauty of tropical flora. A dramatic attempt to capture in a dead herbarium the life that was pulsating so quickly in the jungle that it was devouring itself. And the smell of decaying green, always present at the edge of perception, was a constant memento mori for his collection. Completing this logistical pandemonium was a living, screaming cargo that turned a serious scientific expedition into something that resembled an absurd floating circus or a ghostly Noah's Ark drifting into the heart of darkness. Around the boat, on the shore and in makeshift baskets woven from reeds and liana vines, there was a menagerie of animals that they had already captured or bought from the local Indians. Huge, colorful macaws, whose feathers glowed like liquid fire in colors of crimson and azure, emitted deafening, eardrum-busting screams. Small, agile Saimri monkeys and the capuchin monkeys ran nervously around the edges of their cages, shaking the bamboo bars, while the sloths, slow and indifferent, hung pinned.
His last night in civilization, spent in a humble, stuffy room far from the river, under a roof that, however flimsy, was still a work of human hands, was for the Prussian scientist a nightmare of anxiety-ridden insomnia, compounded by a tropical storm pounding with full fury. Heavy, leaden clouds hung low to the ground, and blinding, purplish lightning cut through the thick darkness, falling through the cracks of the shutters and creating a dramatic flickering chiaroscuro in the room. Each clap of thunder, shaking the rotten floorboards with the force of an earthquake, sounded like a warning sent by the very soul of the continent to turn back from their chosen path. Humboldt, unable to sleep, spent these hours nervously pacing around the room, his mind racing like a rushing river current, mentally verifying supply lists dozens of times, calibrating equations in his head, and writing down the last letters charged with a strange pathos and a sense of farewell to his relatives and scientific communities in Europe, in which, between the lines of optimism, he smuggled the awareness of the huge, real probability of his own death. That long, sleepless night was a psychological Rubicon. He knew that once they crossed the line in the morning, they would leave behind not only comfortable beds, the security of meals, and the protection of the law, but also the entire predictable, organized value system of the old world, and enter a space where man falls from the top of the food chain to the very bottom, and the only defense against the paralyzing terrorism of nature will be a razor-sharp will and a cool, unshakable intellect. When dawn finally came, gray and sultry and marked by the weight of the coming heat, the banks of the Apure River appeared to them as a bleak and forbidding place, and water itself, cloudy, thick, and the color of spilled, dirty coffee, swirled menacingly, carrying with it uprooted trees and clumps of green vegetation like trophies carried away by the current. A thick, almost tangible fog, resembling stretched, damp cotton wool, hovered just above the surface of the water, sticky and cold, constituting a physical curtain separating them from the rest of the world, and in the light of the barely rising sun, the sky turned a livid purple, giving the entire scene an atmosphere bordering on reality and a dark dream. The process of lowering the massive piragua, laden with tons of cargo, into the water required almost superhuman effort and heroic determination of the entire crew of a dozen or so indigenous rowers, whose muscles were straining to the limit, with veins pulsing under their dark skin, glistening with sweat, pressing their bare feet into the slippery, sinking mud, struggling against the mass of wood. It seemed as if the earth itself was trying to stop them, as the deep black mud of the riverbank sucked the bottom of the boat in a murderous grip. A dull smacking sound accompanied the hull's release at last, and the loud splash as the first drops of dirty water hit the sides sounded like the final decree of fate, followed by the dull, steady plunge of the oars, beginning their arduous journey against the current into the depths of the unknown. The moment they left the shore and began to slowly move through the middle of the riverbed brought an immediate, mind-blowing transformation, an almost physical transition from one dimension of reality to another, much more primal and overwhelming. A few strokes of the oars, a few bends of the river were enough for the shabby buildings, the barking of emaciated dogs, and the rare cries of people to disappear completely, devoured and erased by the monumental, overwhelming walls of saturated dark and predatory green jungle, which, like a gigantic organism, leaned over the water, closing the treetops above them in a claustrophobic green vault. The acoustics of space underwent a drastic, terrifying change. The silence of civilization was immediately replaced by the deafening, bone-vibrating cacophony of the wilderness, the hysterical, ear-piercing screech of millions of cicadas that sounded like the work of a gigantic...
Chapter 4. The River of Jaws.
The exploration of the upper reaches of the Orinoco began with a blow to the senses so powerful and all-encompassing that it resembled a physical blow delivered by untamed nature itself, which abhorred intruders in its ancient kingdom. The river, impossibly wide as an inland sea, rolled its murky, ochre and rusty brown waters with majestic, inexorable force, a gigantic, fluid highway leading straight into the dark core of an unknown, suffocating continent. On both sides of this monstrous, lazy current rose sky-high, almost vertical walls of pristine jungle, resembling gigantic, pulsating green fortresses, the highest battlements of which were lost in low-hanging, leaden clouds of evaporating moisture. The colors of this stunning landscape were both overwhelming and hypnotizingly fascinating, dominated by unimaginably deep greens, saturated almost to the limit, which in the dense shadows of the undergrowth turned into pitch black, impenetrable black, and earthy, rotten browns and dark ochres, creating a palette worthy of the darkest, most dramatic canvases of romantic masters. Sunlight, as in a perfectly orchestrated dramatic act of chiaroscuro, broke through sparsely through the dense, tangled canopy of hundreds of thousands of tree crowns, casting ominous, sharp, point beams of light on the surface of the murky water, and bringing out from the omnipresent darkness single, alien-looking epiphytes with vibrant, almost fluorescent colors of carmine and purple. The humidity of the stagnant air was so palpable and choking that each subsequent breath felt like a painful inhalation of hot, thick soup, and the leather, carefully tanned bindings of the logbooks were immediately covered with a slippery, sticky film of ubiquitous dew.
Alexander von Humboldt, sitting motionless on the narrow, uncomfortable bow of the single-trunk wooden pirogue, clearly felt his original, youthful sense of scientific and adventurous excitement slowly but surely begin to mix with a subcutaneous, pulsating anxiety at the vastness and merciless severity of this primeval world that seemed to watch the intruders with cold, inhuman, and completely indifferent attention. The cacophony of sounds that hit them that first morning was like a deafening symphony composed by a mad demiurge, an uninterrupted wall of noise in which there was no room for even a fraction of a second of the longed-for soothing silence. Above the treetops, in places where the thick fog lazily gave way to the scorching rays of the sun, there could be heard the terrifying guttural screams of howler monkeys, the sound of which, vibrating in the travelers' chests, was reminiscent of the roar of antediluvian beasts or demons guarding the gates of hell, echoing for many miles along the river. The airspace belonged to the majestic macaws, which, like living, brilliant missiles in colors of yellow, blue, and scarlet, pierced the stifling air, their sharp, screeching calls cutting the atmosphere with the precision of a scalpel, contrasting with the low, incessant hum of millions of insects that constituted the acoustic background of this hell. As they approached the shores, forced by the eddies of the powerful current, travelers could see almost microscopic, reminiscent of Ernst Haeckel's engravings, intricate details of the flora, the geometric perfection of giant ferns, twisting vines as thick as the arm of a muscular man, and the rough, bulbous bark of ancient downy trees that resembled the scales of some dormant, gargantuan reptile, densely covered with slippery, damp moss and poisonous mushrooms. The texture of this environment was stunningly physical. Every element of the jungle seemed to be dripping with water, sweating its own juices, and constantly decaying to give life to successive generations of parasitic plants, creating an endless cycle of birth and death unfolding before their eyes with
The calm of the water lasted only a fraction of a second before the surface of the river literally exploded with devastating volcanic force, transforming into a seething, bubbling cauldron in which the water, frothing white, began to change color in the blink of an eye from a murky brown to a light and then a terrifyingly deep arterial crimson of human and animal blood. Hundreds of piranhas, attracted by the vibrations of the fall and the smell of fear, struck from below with an unimaginable, almost mechanical fury, and the water around the struggling, screaming in agony monkey resembled spinning blades shining with silver and steel that cut with Haeckel's surgical precision, tearing off sheets of skin, muscles, and tendons straight to the white, exposed bones. The sound that accompanied this macabre feast was shocking, the loud, percussive snapping of thousands of razor-sharp teeth, like the sound of nuts being crushed or stones hitting each other, mixed with the desperate gurgling of the victim, which fades away with every second as it is dragged inexorably under the bloody surface, having no chance of escape or defense. The brutal efficiency of this ecosystem was paralyzing. The capuchin's entire body, which weighed several kilograms, was reduced to a naked, devoured skeleton and shreds of red foam in less time than it would take to load and fire a gun, making travelers aware of the true, untamed nature of the predators inhabiting this tank. The phenomenon was so incredibly fast and violent that it did not resemble a natural act of feeding, but rather a ruthless, programmed chemical reaction thrown into solution, the merciless annihilation of living matter by a horde of perfectly adapted killing machines from which there was no mercy or rescue, which filled the hearts of the crew with pure, unadulterated terror.
Humboldt, looking at the slowly blurring red spot that only a moment earlier had been a living, sentient creature, felt icy sweat running down his spine, and the previously secure framework of his highly ordered Prussian mind began to tremble at its foundations, unable to contain the enormity of this original, completely senseless in human opinion, slaughter. Throughout his academic life in Europe, he regarded nature as a vast, magnificent collection of fascinating specimens, a gigantic cabinet of curiosities that, with enough patience, brass instruments, and glass cases, could be measured, classified in Latin registers, and pinned on boards for display in civilized capitals. But here, in the suffocating and death-stinking waters of the Orinoco, he realized with terrifying clarity that nature was a gigantic, breathing, insatiable monster, a soulless, ever-hungry meat grinder that digested anything that showed signs of weakness, disregarding any human notions of beauty, harmony, or any evolutionary meaning beyond bare survival. The sublimation of horror, so close to the heart of Caspar David Friedrich's painting, ceased to be just an intellectual, aesthetic concept discussed in salons and became a tangible, painful, everyday reality, making him aware of his own, even microscopic insignificance in the face of these uncontrolled ancient forces. All his carefully developed taxonomic systems seemed absurd to him now, even comic in their helplessness in the face of the brutality with which the jungle and the river enforced their laws, where one false step meant the end of the road in the jaws of invisible predators. Unfortunately, the shock and horror caused by the sight of the eaten monkey did not prevent the expedition from making a tragic mistake, caused by chronic fatigue, paralyzing heat, and a momentary deadly distraction of one of the indigenous rowers, who for a moment forgot about the most important rule of the Orinoco. Carlos, a young, strong man.
Chapter 5. The Electric Eels of Calabozo. Before the expedition reached the rushing, majestic currents of the Orinoco proper, it was forced to deviate from the main trail, delving into the endless plains of Calabozo, scorched by the merciless sun. The harsh, hostile landscape known as llanos greeted them with a suffocating, almost palpable heat that distorted the horizon with trembling mirages, making the world around them feel like an unreal, feverish dream. The landscape contrasted drastically with the stuffy green, dark and claustrophobic jungle they had just emerged from, dominated by parched, drought-cracked earthy browns, faded yellows, and sparse, stunted bushes that seemed to fight for every drop of life-giving moisture. Alexander von Humboldt, a man made of the clay of the European Enlightenment, for whom the universe was a vast, complex machine waiting to be precisely measured, weighed, and catalogued, initially regarded local tales of giant eels with deep, almost aristocratic skepticism. In his rational, orderly mind, where hard empiricism reigned supreme, there was no place for mythical beasts striking with lightning bolts made of mud. He regarded these stories as typical indigenous hyperbole, exaggerations based on encounters with harmless bioluminescent creatures, or fish that secreted weak, irritating toxins. However, as a true researcher whose curiosity always triumphed over prejudices, he could not ignore the reports repeated with incredible consistency. His well-worn leather journals, filled to the brim with rows of microscopic, pedantic notes, begged for new data, and his brass scientific instruments, gleaming in the harsh sunlight, seemed to beg to be used. The atmosphere around the expedition became increasingly tense, filled with expectation and unspeakable fear as they approached the supposed habitat of these mysterious tembladores, or shaking beasts, which, according to the locals, could kill an adult man without the slightest physical contact, using only an invisible demonic force hidden in the murky, stagnant waters, which, for the German scientist, was the ultimate challenge to his scientific apparatus.
In the evening, when darkness enveloped the camp, and the only source of light was a flickering fire that cast deep, dramatic chiaroscuro shadows, Humboldt began to meticulously interrogate the local fishermen. The natives' faces, deeply wrinkled and scorched by the sun, resembled the raw bark of an old-growth forest, and their eyes reflected genuine, unfeigned terror when they uttered the name tembladores. They told of monsters hiding under a layer of thick mud, creatures that could not be caught with traditional nets or harpoons, because even approaching the water could result in an inexplicable blow that paralyzed the muscles and stopped the heart beating. Humboldt, sitting on a blanket thrown on the ground, with his pen suspended over the rough paper of his worn leather journal, asked questions with cold, methodical precision, trying to separate the grains of biological truth from the chaff of mythological beliefs. He noted every detail about the habitat, the seasons when the eels were most active, and the physical symptoms their attacks produced, trying to frame the paralyzing shock phenomenon in the framework of the familiar galvanic physics he had recently studied in Italy. Despite his skepticism, the researcher felt a fascinating thrill and realized that he was on the threshold of discovering a phenomenon that could revolutionize the understanding of electricity and animal physiology at that time. With each passing hour, as the stories became more gruesome, and as the night sounds of the jungle intensified the feeling of isolation and danger, a risky decision matured in Humboldt's mind. He decided that he would not be satisfied with just relationships with Dr.
Chapter 6. Pusta Quatela. Delving deeper into the vast, unexplored, and almost mythological Orinoco Basin, the expedition crossed the invisible but tangible boundaries separating the known world from the absolute wilderness, a territory that would soon become the arena of their greatest physical and psychological test. The river, previously majestic and wide, split into an endless, disorienting maze of black water tributaries, waters so saturated with tannins from decaying organic matter that they resembled the thick, dark brew. It was that infamous 40-day crossing through the wilderness, a period of complete erasure from maps and human consciousness, where each subsequent bend of the river revealed only a terrifyingly identical landscape of dense, impenetrable greenery. The visual monotony of the place was overwhelming, the color palette dwindling to deep, saturated greens, earthy browns, and murky tones of black water, only occasionally interrupted by the bright, almost alien glow of exotic flora, reminiscent of the meticulous, even obsessive engravings in old nature volumes, now brought to life in the stifling tropical air. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the multi-story jungle canopy, creating dramatic chiaroscuro effects where sharp golden shafts of light cut through the darkness like blades, bringing out the damp mosses, the rough bark of ancient trees, and the decayed remnants of long fallen leaves from the shadows. In this oppressive, clothed space, the feeling of isolation became absolute. They were just a speck in the gigantic, inert mechanism of nature, slowly consumed by the humidity, heat, and the constant, exhausting effort of navigating this underwater forest. The jungle, contrary to the romantic imagination of European living rooms, did not appear as a gentle paradise garden rich in easily accessible fruits and friendly creatures, but as a merciless, hostile anti-paradise, a place of oppressive sameness, where every direction looked identical and the lack of any human contact led to the verge of madness. This monumental tangle of lianas, thorny palms, and giant epiphytic trees seemed to actively resist their presence, closing behind their boat like a green maw, cutting off any hope of return. The physical and psychological toll of the journey increased with each stroke of the oars as the air, thick with moisture and the smell of decay, became difficult to breathe, and the constant chorus of cicadas and the calls of invisible birds heightened the sense of alienation.
With each passing day, the absence of any traces of human civilization, no smoke from the tribal fires, no paths worn on the muddy banks, no markings on the bark of the trees, made them aware of their utter loneliness on a scale that was downright paralyzing. The jungle wasn't evil or cruel in the human sense. It was just majestically indifferent, functioning according to its own brutal laws of survival, where every plant fought for every ray of light, and the rot of one organism became the foundation of life for thousands of others. In this harsh environment, the romantic vision of the explorer as a triumphant conqueror of nature quickly gave way to the grim reality of a fight for survival, where heroism wasn't about planting flags, but about finding the strength to wake up the next morning in a waterlogged hammock. Decay left no stone unturned, attacking organic and inorganic matter with equal ruthlessness, and its most painful symbol was the scene in which Aimé Bonpland was horrified to discover the destruction of his most valuable botanical specimen. For many days, with pedantic care bordering on reverence, Bonpland prepared a rare species of orchid unknown to science, whose petals shone with an unearthly purple, carefully arranging them between pages of tissue paper in a leather botanical press, believing that this one flower would ensure their immortality in the annals of European science. However, one muggy afternoon,
Chapter 7. Ludzie rzeki.
Alexander von Humboldt and Aimé Bonpland were on the absolute insurmountable edge of physical and mental collapse as the jungle seemed to finally close in around them like a gigantic, green, suffocating doom from which there was no escape. Weeks of constant battle against the merciless, humid heat that settled over their bodies like a hot, wet blanket sapped the last of their vitality, turning the once proud European explorers into shadows of their former selves. The ominous dark waters of the Orinoco River, carrying with it the smell of rotting vegetation and decay, seemed to mock their ambitious scientific plans, while buzzing swarms of mosquitoes mercilessly attacked every inch of exposed skin, leaving painful, itching sores that became instantly infected in this climate. The once precious shiny brass navigation and measurement instruments, carefully imported from the most expensive Paris and Berlin manufacturers, were now covered with a dull greenish patina of moisture, becoming heavy, useless ballast in their half-submerged, leaking pirogue. The sunlight, rarely breaking through the dense claustrophobic canopy of tangled lianas and giant leaves, created dramatic, sharp contrasts on the surface of the murky water, reminiscent of the paintings of romantic masters, only intensifying the feeling of complete loneliness and the overwhelming power of nature, which did not care about their fragile human lives. Humboldt, ravaged by the beginnings of a fever, could hardly keep his eyes open, and his usually receptive and analytical mind was slowly sinking into the dark abyss of resignation, when suddenly, in a split second, the landscape changed drastically. Just when the utterly resigned Humboldt began to accept deep down the macabre thought of dying in that endless, indifferent green ocean, their crumbling pirogue emerged from the thick morning fog at a sharp bend in the river, suddenly revealing a cove hidden in deep darkness and the unexpected outline of a small native settlement, completely isolated from the outside world. The first contact was as tense as a violin string, as indigenous warriors emerged silently from the dense, almost tangible shadow of the tropical forest, with intricate ritual patterns of the red dye of Ornata propria painted on their faces and bodies, holding in their hands several meters long, lethally precise blowpipes and bone-tipped spears. Terrified, Bonpland instinctively reached for his wet musket, but Humboldt, in an act of desperate intuition, held back his friend's hand, commanding absolute stillness and raising his own empty hands in a universal gesture of submission and peaceful intentions.
For several long, endless minutes that seemed to last for centuries, both groups remained in absolute, frozen stillness, examining each other with their eyes over the smooth surface of the dark water, while the only sound to disturb the silence was the deafening squawking of parrots hidden in the treetops and the heavy breathing of exhausted Europeans. Finally, seeing the pitiful, almost moribund condition of the newcomers, their sunting cheeks, chapped lips, and trembling limbs, the leader of the hunter group lowered his weapon with a barely noticeable sigh, and the razor-sharp tension hanging in the stifling air dissipated like a soap bubble, giving way to a cautious but clear desire to help the strangers who had entered their isolated world. The transition from a state of constant threat to life, starvation, and disease to unexpected salvation was so sudden and surreal that Humboldt's exhausted mind could barely keep up with registering and processing the new reality when the native inhabitants with extraordinary skill helped them pull the leaking boat to the muddy shore and led them staggering into the very heart of their village, hidden from the world. The architecture of the settlement, although
Chapter 8. The Bifurcation Point. The last murderous strokes of the oars seemed to last forever, and each movement of the arms of the native rowers and the scientists themselves was a manifestation of the triumph of the human will over the overwhelming power of Amazonian nature. The air was thick, humid, and sticky, almost like a physical barrier that they had to break through with each heartbeat. The heat poured down from the merciless sky, penetrating the dense canopy of tangled treetops that rose above their heads like the green vault of an ancient cathedral. Sweat flooded the eyes, stung the numerous wounds and scratches that were souvenirs from weeks of struggling through the hostile jungle, and swarms of bloodthirsty mosquitoes constantly attacked every exposed piece of human skin. Despite this overwhelming physical exhaustion, an extremely bright fire of determination burned in Alexander von Humboldt's mind, fueled by an almost obsessive need to discover the truth. For years, sitting in their comfortable, cool offices in Paris and Berlin, European cartographers and scientists categorically denied the existence of a natural connection between the Orinoco and Amazon basins, dismissing the Cassiquare River as a mere myth, a legend spawned by the feverish minds of the early conquistadors. However, Humboldt, guided not only by scientific skepticism towards established dogmas, but above all by the invaluable knowledge passed on to him by local tribes, knew that this alleged myth was a tangible hydrological reality to which they were getting closer with each meter of turbid water they traversed. Suddenly, almost imperceptibly to the untrained eye, the character of the surrounding landscape began to undergo a subtle but profound transformation. The river, which had previously flowed its waters with a certain decisive force, began to lose its momentum, and its current became more and more lazy, sluggish, even confused. The geometry of the space around them was distorted. The riverbanks were no longer clear lines of demarcation separating land from water, and instead transformed into blurry, swampy transition zones, overgrown with giant ferns and mangroves, whose roots resembled the tangled tentacles of monsters from the depths. The light had also changed, taking on a dramatic, almost theatrical chiaroscuro quality, where the deep, inky shadows of the ancient trees contrasted brutally with the sparse, blinding shafts of golden sunlight that managed to penetrate the thicket. The water changed its shade to a dark tea-brown, acting like a polished dark mirror that reflected the infinite green of the jungle, creating the illusion of being suspended in a void where the boundaries between sky, earth, and the river were blurred. In this euphoric yet eerie setting, Humboldt felt they were entering a liminal space, a place where the normal laws of physics and geography seemed suspended in time and space.
Central to this slow navigation were the indigenous guides, whose ancient, deep-seated knowledge of this environment provided the only true compass in this green maze. For them, this extraordinary place was neither an anomaly nor a scientific sensation. It was an integral, natural part of their world, a communication route used by their ancestors for countless generations. Humboldt, unlike many arrogant European explorers of his era, had great respect for these people, closely observing how they read the river from subtle signs invisible to foreigners, from the specific arrangement of leaves on the water surface, from the subtle change in the smell of the wind, from the quiet cries of birds in the treetops. Their silent confidence and precise oar movements contrasted with the scientists' feverish anticipation, and this interaction between the Western empirical drive to classify the world and the indigenous holistic experience of nature created a unique dynamic aboard their little
Chapter 9. Descent into Darkness. The journey, contrary to the naive hopes of the exhausted bodies, was not coming to an end, but was entering a completely new, terrifying dimension when their small boats finally left the murky, turbulent waters of Casiquiare and entered the disturbingly calm surface of the Rio Negro, a river of darkness that owed its name to its unusual, almost tarry color. This sudden change of environment was a shock to both the senses and the scientific mind of Humboldt, who immediately began to analyze the chemical composition of this amazing phenomenon, concluding that the water acquires its color, like a strong tea infusion, percolating through vast expanses of decaying vegetation, leaves, barks, and roots, which release into it enormous amounts of tannins and phenolic compounds. The color was not simply dirty or cloudy, but resembled a deep, saturated shade of the purest obsidian or dark mahogany, which, under the influence of sunlight, acquired blood-red reflections, giving the river the appearance of some gigantic liquid organism with a sinister, vampiric character. This transition from the yellow-brown, mud-laden waters to this black abyss meant crossing an invisible but very tangible ecological boundary that changed everything in their surroundings, from flora to fauna, putting the expedition in a state of permanent tension, intensified by the omnipresent humidity, the smell of decay, and the feeling of absolute, overwhelming isolation from anything known to them, forms of civilization, or even a familiar landscape. This environment seemed to reject intruders from the outside, and the thickened, humic acid-filled river waters constituted not only a physical barrier for many species, but also a psychological barrier for travelers, who with each stroke of the oars felt themselves sinking deeper and deeper into the bowels of an inscrutable, hostile, and completely indifferent to their fate continent. As the river's chemistry changed, the biodiversity also underwent a drastic transformation, which they were initially greeted with great relief, because the high acidity of the black waters of the Rio Negro made the environment extremely inhospitable to mosquito larvae, freeing travelers from the incessant, maddening buzzing and painful bites that had come earlier in the journey. They turned every night into real hell. However, this initial relief quickly turned into deep concern when scientists realized that the same environment that repelled insects was also toxic or simply too barren for the vast majority of fish species, which meant a drastic depletion of their natural food sources and introduced the specter of starvation. The banks of the river no longer echoed with the squawking of exotic birds or the life of wild animals drinking water in the shallows. An eerie, almost graveyard-like silence reigned here, broken only by the muffled splash of oars and the occasional ominous crack of a branch in the distance, which added to the impression of traveling through some dead zone, a post-apocalyptic landscape devoid of the vitality for which the Amazon Basin is so famous.
This drastic reduction in life forms, initially viewed by Humboldt as merely a fascinating ecological phenomenon, soon became a suffocating burden, as the lack of dynamic faunal interactions that he had previously demonstrated so scrupulously in his notes on the web of life were now replaced by the dominance of the slow, silent process of decomposition and chemical destruction of organic matter. The dark tone of the river was not only a chemical puzzle, but also a powerful optical illusion, because its absolutely smooth, tarry surface acted like a perfect, gigantic mirror, reflecting the sky and surrounding the jungle with such terrifying sharpness and fidelity that any boundary between reality and its reflection was blurred. As the boat glided across this dark surface, the travelers often had dizzying,
Chapter 10. The Chimborazo Revelation. The preparations in the bustling colonial capital of Quito, suspended like a condor's nest high in the Andean Cordillera, were the prologue to the most ambitious, murderous, and intellectually revolutionary undertaking of Alexander von Humboldt's entire career to date, requiring not only an iron will, but also a superhuman cognitive obsession. The city, teeming with life at heights unusual for Europeans, pulsated with exotic energy, and its narrow, steep-cobbled streets were filled with the thick, tangible smell of burning eucalyptus wood, fried corn flour, sweet cigar smoke, and the damp, thick wool of alpacas, from which the ponchos of the local Indians were woven. Humboldt and his tireless but physically exhausted companion, Aimé Bonpland, surrounded by a crowd of curious onlookers, with extraordinary, even morbid care, checked, calibrated, and packed their priceless, delicate arsenal of scientific instruments that they would use to explore the great Chimborazo volcano. This sleeping titan of ice, snow, and black rock, then considered in European scientific circles to be the absolute highest peak of the entire planet, a kind of roof of the world, rose majestically, ominously, and defiantly on the distant horizon, casting its long, frosty, psychological shadow over all their plans and dreams. The process of complex recruitment of local guides, tough-as-nails Peruja Indians and hardy mestizos serving as porters, or so-called cargueros, was extremely difficult because the indigenous inhabitants held this particular mountain in devout fear, believing deep in their souls that its merciless, wind-swept, icy slopes were a cursed place, the seat of the mighty spirits, and an area that definitely does not belong to the world of living beings. With each passing day in Quito, under the blue, thinning sky of the high equator, a terrifying mountain of luggage grew, consisting not only of food supplies, but above all of the instruments of knowledge, shiny brass barometers in which mercury trembled, extremely fragile, precise glass thermometers for measuring the smallest fluctuations in temperatures, hygrometers equipped with human hair to record the humidity of condensed air, electrometers with delicate gold leaves to measure electrostatic charges, and the famous sophisticated cyanometer invented by de Saussure, used for accurate numerical measurement of the intensity of the blue sky at various ceilings. All these unimaginably delicate objects had to be carefully and methodically wrapped in layers of raw wool, damp moss, and thickly tanned animal skins, and then placed in specially constructed fabric-lined wooden boxes to withstand the brutal shocks on the backs of the mules. The contrast between the crude, mathematical, cold precision of these European tools and the brutal, unpredictable, chaotic, and overwhelming nature of the Andean Cordillera was striking, creating a visual and conceptual dissonance that was both overwhelming and fascinating for the Prussian scientist. For Humboldt, Chimborazo was not just a dead physical obstacle to overcome, just another mountain to climb to satisfy the trivial vanity of an alpinist or adventurer.
It was a gigantic, natural, multi-level laboratory, the ultimate key to understanding the hidden, subtle mechanisms that govern the entire complex natural world. In these last, nervous days of preparation, a specific tension was building up inside him, a dangerous but intoxicating mixture of romantic, sublime excitement before communing with the sublime of nature, and a deep atavistic fear of the unknown, because no man in recorded history had ever attempted to carry the entire achievements of Enlightenment Western science to such heights as to be there on the roof of the world. For Humboldt, Chimborazo was not just a dead, physical obstacle to overcome, just another mountain to climb to satisfy the trivial vanity of an alpinist or adventurer. It was a gigantic, natural, multi-level laboratory, the ultimate key to understanding the hidden, subtle mechanisms that govern the entire complex natural world. In these last, nervous days of preparation, a specific tension was building up inside him, a dangerous but intoxicating mixture of romantic, sublime excitement before communing with the sublime of nature, and a deep atavistic fear of the unknown, because no man in recorded history had ever attempted to carry the entire achievements of Enlightenment Western science to such heights as to be there on the roof of the world.
Chapter 11. Polityka nauki.
The journey continued uninterrupted, but now, after his experiences in the dark, damp bowels of the Amazon jungle, Alexander von Humboldt saw the world through a completely new, intricately woven lens. He was no longer just a collector of plants and a hunter of minerals. He became a reader of the great book of nature, in which every creature, every drop of water, and every gust of wind were inextricably interwoven into one web pulsing with life. As he traversed the centers of colonial power in South America, from monumental Lima through towering Bogotá to Mexico City, teeming with life and blood, this new perspective also began to encompass human systems. He noticed that these cities were not isolated islands of civilization, but brutal growths on the fabric of nature, sucking its vital juices. Entering Bogotá, surrounded by the majestic peaks of the Andes, he felt the striking contrast between the infinite beauty and harmony of nature and the artificial, oppressive order imposed by the Spanish crown. The dense, saturated greens of the mountain cloud forests, full of foreign, vibrant colors of exotic flora, seemed to retreat from the cold, geometric rigor of colonial architecture. The dark tones of the river water now reflected not only the crowns of ancient trees, but also the shallows of slaves working beyond their strength. Humboldt, armed with his scientific fame and aristocratic connections, began to infiltrate the highest echelons of this hierarchy. His mind, once focused solely on taxonomy and barometric measurements, now analyzed structures of power, economics, and oppression with the same chilling precision with which he examined the anatomy of a rare insect. It became clear to him that it was impossible to separate the fate of the earth from the fate of its inhabitants, and politics and science were in fact two currents of the same dangerous river. In Lima, the city of kings, Humboldt was invited to a lavish banquet given by the powerful Spanish viceroy. The dining room was filled with splendor, illuminated by the dramatic chiaroscuro of hundreds of wax candles, reminiscent of the paintings of Caspar David Friedrich, crossed with the precise engravings of Ernst Haeckel. The shimmering light was reflected in the polished silver, crystal goblets, and heavy gold epaulets of the gathered officers, creating an atmosphere of almost stuffy decadence. Humboldt, in his impeccable European tailcoat, graced the company, charming the gathered aristocrats with tales of electric eels and volcanic craters. But beneath the facade of the suave scientist was now a determined investigator. While sipping fine wine, he began to subtly but persistently question the viceroy's policies. With a smile on his face, he asked about agricultural monocultures and their impact on soil degradation, smoothly moving on to the topic of the efficiency of forced labor of indigenous people. He used elegant, courtly language to smuggle in the most radical ideas, putting the viceroy on the intellectual defensive. The air in the room thickened with unexpressed tension, as the Prussian, with cold logic, demonstrated that a system based on brutal exploitation was not only morally bankrupt, but above all, economically inefficient. The gold cutlery suddenly seemed to weigh heavy in the hands of the revelers, and the dark shadows cast by the candles on the walls of the palace reminded Humboldt of the thousands of ruined lives that financed this spectacle of wealth. That night was a turning point, proving to him that scientific truth can be the sharpest weapon in the clash with ruthless politics. Determined to gather irrefutable evidence for his theories, Humboldt used his privileges to gain access to secret and closely guarded colonial archives and statistical offices. In the cool, shaded rooms of archives in Bogotá and Mexico City, amid the tangible textures of old, musty-smelling parchment and cracked, worn moss on stone windowsills, he spent long weeks analyzing piles.
Chapter 12. The Current of Life. The port of Callao lay suffocating beneath a heavy, impenetrable blanket of coastal fog, the infamous Peruvian garua, which muted the brutal equatorial sun into a pale, sickly disk hanging ominously in the slate-gray sky. The air was thick, practically viscous, saturated with the overpowering, pungent stench of pelican guano, rotting kelp, and the damp, decaying timber of ancient Spanish galleons that had long since surrendered to the relentless assault of the Pacific. Alexander von Humboldt stood at the very edge of the weathered wooden docks, his boots sinking slightly into the slime-coated planks, feeling a profound, restless agitation coursing through his veins. After the vibrant, overwhelming, and infinitely complex green hell of the Amazon rainforest, this stark, monochromatic coastal desert felt like an alien purgatory, a desolate waiting room where time itself seemed to stagnate alongside the briny harbor water. He was waiting for a ship to carry his expedition further onward, but idleness was a physical torment to his ceaselessly churning mind. Seeking some grounding connection to the physical world around him, he crouched down, his fine European coat grazing the filth of the pier, and thrust his bare hand deep into the dark, oily water of the Pacific Ocean. The sensation was immediate, electric, and utterly confounding. The water was violently, shockingly cold. At this tropical latitude, mere degrees from the equator, where the ambient heat of the arid coastline baked the earth to a cracked, dusty brown, the ocean should have been entirely tepid, a warm, stagnant bath akin to the waters of the Caribbean or the equatorial Atlantic, which he had so meticulously measured months prior. Instead, the biting chill that seized his fingers felt as though it had been drawn directly from the frozen, crystalline depths of a glacial crevasse. Humboldt pulled his dripping hand from the sea, staring at the droplets falling from his fingertips as if they were alien artifacts. His mind, forever operating as a vast, interconnected engine of comparative data, immediately began cross-referencing this single sensory anomaly against thousands of previous temperature readings inscribed in his leather-bound journals. This coldness was not a mere local aberration. It was a profound geological mystery, a whisper from the hidden depths of the planet, demanding to be deciphered by the instruments of Enlightenment science. The anomaly of the frigid water ignited a manic, consuming obsession within Humboldt, transforming his restless waiting into a frenzied theater of scientific inquiry. He began pacing the creaking docks with the ferocity of a caged predator, his sharp eyes scanning the harbor, not for the overdue ship, but for the staggering, almost grotesque abundance of marine life that suddenly made perfect, terrible sense.
The sky above was not merely cloudy, it was physically choked, darkened by monumental swirling vortexes of seabirds, millions of boobies, cormorants, and pelicans, whose synchronized geometric flight patterns echoed the intricate symmetrical biological illustrations he would later envision, a living architecture in the air. They plunged into the murky, deep green waters like an endless barrage of feathered artillery, emerging with beaks overflowing with shimmering silver anchovies. The water itself seemed to boil with life, a dense, nutrient-rich soup that defied the barren, lifeless aesthetic of the adjacent coastal desert. Humboldt's profound intuition, his deeply held belief in the Naturgemälde, the interconnected web of all living and non-living things, screamed that this incredible biological density and the shocking temperature of the water were inextricably linked. The coldness was the very catalyst of this chaotic abundance, providing the underlying structure for this localized explosion of life. To prove this, to chart the invisible mechanics of this watery domain, he could not remain on the shore. He needed to.
Chapter 13. Son of the New World. The 5-year exhausting odyssey through the wildest and most undiscovered regions of the globe was finally coming to its inevitable end, and the ship carrying on board one of the greatest minds of the era slowly, with almost majestic reluctance, crossed the murky waters of the Delaware Bay, thick with silt and sediment. For Alexander von Humboldt, a man who in recent years had faced the merciless elements of the Amazon jungle, inhaled the rarefied air of the Andean peaks, and made his way through the impenetrable thickets of the Orinoco, this final stop in the United States was not just an ordinary tourist whim or an escape from the hardships of the sea journey back to Europe. He was approaching the shores of a new, experimental state, a young republic, which in the eyes of European thinkers appeared as a great laboratory of the ideas of the Enlightenment, as a promise of a new era for all humanity. He stood on the wooden deck of the ship, resting his hands on the rough, salt-soaked side, and his eyes, accustomed to detecting the slightest anomalies in the structure of leaves or rock formations, now absorbed the approaching American shore with undiminished intensity. The weather that day perfectly reflected the mood of the Romantic era, reminiscent of Caspar David Friedrich's canvases. Heavy, leaden clouds swirled low over the horizon, creating a dramatic, almost theatrical spectacle of light and shadow, in which pale, sinister rays of the sun, like blades, pierced through the thick suspension of moisture to illuminate the foaming crests of the waves for a split second. Next to him, carefully secured in heavy leather trunks lined with velvet and worn over the years of expeditions, were his most valuable treasures: thousands of dried specimens of exotic flora, precise geological sketches, vials filled with samples from distant rivers and volcanoes, and above all, his priceless diaries, whose pages, covered with tiny, dense handwriting, were a testament to the power of human cognition. The brass fittings of his measuring instruments, sextants, barometers, and chronometers, although covered with a thick layer of patinated greenish tarnish, a reminder of the corrosive humidity of equatorial forests, still gleamed in those rare moments when the sun touched them, a reminder of Humboldt's unwavering belief that the entire chaotic, wild, and dangerous world could be measured, cataloged, and understood through using the power of human reason. This was no longer the return of an anonymous traveler. This was the triumphant entry of someone who had become an absolute scientific celebrity, an intellectual titan who, with his own hands and indomitable will, had pushed the boundaries of what was known, and who now, with his heart beating to the rhythm of the upcoming meeting with the founding fathers of this young nation, was preparing for the final intellectual clash in the lands of the New World. When the ship finally reached the muddy, bustling docks of Philadelphia, the contrast between the wild, untamed nature with which Humboldt had been exposed for the last half of a decade and the bustling heart of American civilization struck him with double force. On the wharf, amid barrels of molasses, coils of hemp rope, and the smell of rotting fish mingling with the smell of wet wood, a delegation of the most prominent minds of the American Philosophical Society awaited him. These men, in impeccably tailored but slightly dusty coats, with wigs on their heads and silver walking sticks in their hands, were the embodiment of European rationalism transplanted to the harsh American soil. Philadelphia greeted the traveler with the striking, sticky humidity of early summer, which strangely reminded him of the muggy, oppressive afternoons spent in the Amazon basin, although here, instead of the smell of orchids and biomass decaying in the jungle, the air was filled with the smell of hot bricks, horse dung, and burning coal. As Humboldt descended the gangplank, the crowd of onlookers, led by rumor.
Chapter 15. The Web of Life. In a dim Berlin office where the air was thick with the smell of dust, old parchments, and dried botanical specimens, the lonely struggle of one mind began to transform into a worldwide cascade of inspiration. Alexander von Humboldt, leaning over an oak desk covered with stacks of notes, maps drawn with a trembling but precise hand, and shiny brass navigation instruments, was no longer just a traveler. He was becoming the architect of a completely new way of perceiving the universe. The sunlight, barely filtering through the heavy velvet curtains, created dramatic chiaroscuro effects in the room, illuminating the dust particles dancing in the air like microscopic planets around the sun. In this light, his face, scarred with deep wrinkles from the merciless sun of the Andes and the humid heat of the Amazon, seemed carved in stone, yet burned with the unrelenting inner fire of intellectual passion. It was here, in the silence filled only with the rustle of turning pages and the rasp of a quill pen, that his greatest vision crystallized, the concept of nature not as a dead, catalogued set of independent objects, but as one pulsating with life, unimaginably complex network of relationships. Every leaf he collected, every temperature he recorded, every barometric observation, and every mineral he brought back from the New World now became individual threads that Humboldt painstakingly wove into a monumental tapestry of knowledge. This revolutionary idea, like a stone thrown into the calm surface of a lake, would soon cause waves that would irrevocably change the face of 19th century science, art, and politics, reaching the farthest corners of the globe and igniting the minds of people who were to shape a new era of human understanding. The understanding that the destruction of one element of this delicate ecosystem would have irreversible consequences for the rest was a paradigm so radical that it initially aroused disbelief among scientific elites accustomed to the rigid, linear Linnaean classifications. However, the truth contained in Humboldt's words, supported by an unimaginable amount of precise empirical data, had an elemental force that was irresistible. His work ceased to be just a record of an expedition and became the gospel of a new religion of nature in which every organism, from the smallest lichen on the slopes of a volcano to a mighty jaguar roaming the jungle, played a key and irreplaceable role in the great cosmic drama of survival. Thousands of miles from his stuffy Berlin office, in the cramped cabin of HMS Beagle, filled with the smell of sea salt, tar, and raw wood, young Charles Darwin, just 22 years old, experienced an intellectual shock that was to define his entire future life. The faint, quivering light of a tallow lantern, swaying to the rhythm of the ocean waves, cast long, restless shadows on the wooden walls, increasing the feeling of claustrophobia and isolation in the vastness of the waters. Despite the severe seasickness that sapped his strength and made every movement of the ship intensify his physical suffering, Darwin could not tear his eyes away from the book open in front of him. It was the personal narratives of Alexander von Humboldt, a carefully bound volume in worn leather that he had received as a gift from his mentor, John Stevens Henslow. With each sentence he read, with each phenomenon described by the Prussian traveler, the young naturalist felt a growing, almost feverish excitement that completely drowned out the physical discomfort. His hands trembled as he nervously underlined subsequent fragments of the text with a hard pencil, making dense, chaotic notes in the margins of the pages, which over time were to become the nucleus of the most powerful theory in the history of biology. Humboldt's style, a unique combination of poetic sensitivity, romantic delight.
Chapter 16. The Last Observer.
The gray, unforgiving light of a Berlin winter filtered weakly through the frosted window panes of the study, casting long, melancholic shadows across a room that had become a sprawling, chaotic mausoleum of a lifetime spent cataloging the universe. At 89 years old, Alexander von Humboldt sat enveloped in the stifling warmth of his heavy woolen blankets, an ancient monarch holding court over a kingdom of dried botanical specimens, meticulously labeled mineral fragments, towering stacks of unread correspondence from every corner of the civilized world, and the omnipresent, suffocating scent of aged parchment and creeping mortality. His physical form, once seemingly indestructible, once capable of scaling the frozen, jagged peaks of Chimborazo and surviving the malarial fevers of the Orinoco, had finally betrayed him, rendering his limbs fragile and his breath a shallow, rasping labor. Yet, behind eyes that had grown milky with cataracts, the fire of an insatiable, world-consuming curiosity burned with the same terrifying intensity as it had 6 decades prior. He was a man out of time, a living ghost haunting the dawn of the industrial age, having stubbornly outlived his beloved brother Wilhelm, his loyal, tempestuous companion Aimé Bonpland, and nearly every single mind of his generation that had dared to dream of understanding the totality of nature. He was the last of the great polymaths, the last solitary observer who believed that a single human mind could synthesize the infinite complexities of the cosmos into a unified, harmonious whole. And sitting in the chilling silence of that room, he felt the crushing, unbearable weight of that solitary existence. In the hushed, dusty atmosphere of the study, the only sound to be heard was the frantic, rhythmic scratching of a steel-nibbed pen against thick paper, wielded by his tireless, infinitely patient assistant, Johann Seifert, who sat hunched over a massive oak desk, furiously attempting to capture the torrential flow of ideas pouring from the dying visionary's lips. Humboldt was dictating the final, monumental pages of the 5th volume of Cosmos, his magnum opus, a desperate, breathless race against the creeping shadow of death to articulate the grand, unifying theory of everything that had consumed his entire existence. His voice, though reduced to a trembling, gravelly whisper, carried the unyielding authority of a man who had measured the pulse of the earth with his own bare hands, commanding the celestial bodies, the shifting tectonic plates, and the microscopic infusoria to align in his sprawling narrative. He pushed himself relentlessly, agonizingly, ignoring the searing pain in his arthritic joints and the overwhelming exhaustion that threatened to pull him into eternal sleep, driven by a profound, agonizing fear that if he did not finish, the profound truth of the universe's interconnectedness would be lost forever to a world rapidly descending into the blinding, fragmented darkness of specialization. He spoke of nebulae spinning in the cold void of space and of the microscopic organisms thriving in a single drop of stagnant water, weaving them together with an invisible, unbreakable thread of poetic science, trying desperately to leave behind a map not just of the physical world, but of the divine, underlying harmony that governed every atom of creation, before his voice was silenced forever. With a trembling, almost skeletal hand, the ancient scientist gestured for Seifert to pause, his fading gaze drifting slowly across the room to rest upon a massive, breathtakingly detailed map of the world that dominated the entirety of the Western Wall, a map that he himself had fundamentally and irrevocably redrawn through decades of relentless exploration and intellectual defiance. It was a cartographic masterpiece, covered in the sweeping, elegant curves of the isothermal lines he had single-handedly invented, lines that ignored the arbitrary, arrogant political,